If this were truly irrelevant, it would not need to disappear so completely. Things that don't matter usually fade. Things that threaten a system tend to vanish. There is a plant labeled a weed that outperforms salmon on omega balance. It sits outside the charts, outside the shelves, outside the lesson plans. This requires no conspiracy, only incentives. Systems remember what scales cleanly and forget what does not. So the question is not whether it works. The question is why almost nobody remembers it. Not because it failed, not because it lacked proof, but because it refuses to fit. It resists standardization, resists easy harvest, resists neat categories. It offers too much at once and asks too little in return. When education simplifies, it trims the edges. When markets optimize, they prune aggressively. What remains is what moves fast, stores long, and sells predictably. Everything else is reclassified, minimized, or mislabeled. Over time, absence becomes normal. Silence becomes tradition. And once you notice how completely it vanished, the plant has a name, and the name matters because it was assigned long before modern nutrition decided what counts. It is sea buckthorn, a hardy shrub native to Eurasia documented across Europe and Asia, growing where soil is thin, climates are hostile, and conventional crops fail. Botanically classified as Hippophae rhamnoides, it has never been rare, never exotic, and never engineered. It grows openly, often aggressively, along coastlines, mountain slopes, and degraded land. For centuries, it was cultivated not for yield, but for resilience. That distinction would later become decisive. Sea buckthorn is not defined by a single extract or isolated compound. Its structure matters. The berries contain two distinct oils, one from the seed and one from the pulp, each with a different fatty acid profile. This is not marketing language. It is basic plant chemistry. The pulp oil is unusually rich in palmitoleic acid known as omega-7. The seed oil carries omega-3 and omega-6. Together within the same fruit, they form a profile that does not fit neatly into existing dietary categories. This plant has been used as food oil and medicine across multiple cultures without ever becoming a staple commodity. It was never domesticated into monoculture. It was never optimized for mechanized harvest. Those were not oversights. They were choices. Sea buckthorn survived because it solved ecological problems, not because it served supply chains. Its role was functional, not commercial. What matters here is not that the plant exists, but that it was never reorganized to meet modern definitions of value. That decision repeated over time shaped what followed. Long before laboratories measured fatty acids, this plant had already passed through systems that only kept what worked. In Central Asia and along the Himalayan plateau, sea buckthorn appeared in medical texts not as folklore, but as material practice. Tibetan medical compendiums compiled between the 8th and 12th centuries reference its use, repeatedly placing it among core substances rather than secondary remedies. It was administered for digestion, circulation, and tissue recovery, not symbolically, but functionally. Centuries later, the plant resurfaced in a very different context. During the 20th century, Soviet research institutions catalogued sea buckthorn as a strategic botanical resource. Its oil was studied for skin repair and resilience under extreme conditions. This was not consumer wellness. It was applied physiology. After the Chernobyl nuclear accident, sea buckthorn oil was among the substances approved for treating radiation-related skin damage. That approval did not come from tradition. It came from institutional review under pressure. None of this required belief. It required documentation. Across eras, the authority changes, but the pattern does not. Empires, monastic medicine, and modern states all arrived at the same plant through different incentives. Each time it was retained because it performed under constraint. What changed later was not the evidence, but the framework used to interpret it. Modern analysis did not contradict what earlier systems observed. It narrowed it. When sea buckthorn was examined through contemporary nutritional science, The focus shifted from the plant as a whole to its fatty acid profile. What stood out was not omega-3, which was already well known, but palmitoleic acid classified as omega-7. Unlike omega-3 and 6, omega-7 is not considered essential because the human body can synthesize it. That technical detail quietly shaped how it was valued. Yet biology is not governed only by deficiency. Omega-7 is a structural lipid. It appears in cell membranes, particularly in epithelial tissue, that lines the gut, the eyes, the skin, and internal mucosal surfaces. This is not speculative. It is established physiology. When dietary omega-7 is present, it enters pathways associated with membrane integrity and lipid signaling rather than energy storage. That distinction matters. Sea buckthorn is unusual because omega-7 is not an afterthought in its composition. In the pulp oil, it is a dominant fatty acid. At the same time, the seed oil contributes omega-3 and 6. These oils coexist within the same berry, not blended later, but formed together. Fat-soluble vitamins are present in the same matrix. Absorption is built in. This is a biological configuration, not a formulation strategy. Here is the uncomfortable part. Once nutrients are separated from their structure, education follows the fragments. Systems teach what can be isolated, standardized, and dosed. They struggle with what arrives already integrated. Once nutrition became an industry value, was assigned differently. Ingredients were no longer judged by how they functioned in living systems, but by how efficiently they moved through supply chains. Omega-3 fit perfectly. It could be extracted from fish or algae, concentrated, standardized, encapsulated, and sold as a repeatable unit. The buyer knew what they were purchasing. The manufacturer knew how to scale it. The system rewarded clarity. Sea buckthorn did not offer that clarity. Its value is distributed across structure rather than isolated into a single dominant commodity. The berry yields 2 oils with different properties. Harvesting is labor-intensive. Mechanization damages the fruit. Processing requires cold handling and immediate stabilization. None of this is accidental. It is simply incompatible with high-volume throughput. So the loop formed naturally. Manufacturers invested in inputs that scaled cleanly. Educators taught nutrients that had clear dosage frameworks. Retail shelves reflected what could be stocked predictably. Consumers learned to recognize names that appeared everywhere. What could not be simplified was not banned, it was sidelined. This was a choice, not a suppression. No rule was written against sea buckthorn. It just never fit the incentives that determine what gets repeated. Over time, repetition becomes legitimacy. Absence becomes irrelevance. We were never told this plant did not matter. It was simply placed outside the loop that defines what matters. At some point, this stops being about the plant. It becomes about how knowledge is filtered. Most people never rejected omega-7. They were never asked to consider it. Curricula reduce complexity to teach efficiency. Media favors repetition over nuance. What enters the system is what fits the frame already in place. So the absence feels natural. If something mattered, we assume we would have heard of it. If it was useful, it would be everywhere. That assumption is comfortable. It allows us to trust the outline without inspecting the gaps. That assumption deserves to be examined. We tend to believe that relevance guarantees visibility. If something mattered, it would appear in textbooks. If it worked, it would be repeated. But that logic only holds inside a system that rewards completeness. Ours does not. It rewards clarity, speed, and replication. So knowledge is filtered before it is ever questioned. What survives is not what integrates best with biology, but what integrates best with instruction. Concepts that are difficult to summarize are postponed. Subjects that resist standard examples are deferred. Over time, deferral looks identical to dismissal. This is why the absence never triggered suspicion. There was no prohibition to react against, no warning label, no controversy, only silence. And silence rarely feels like a loss when you are not aware something was removed. We did not fail to remember this. We were never trained to notice its absence. The system did not lie. It simply optimized. And optimization by definition discards anything that slows the process. Once you recognize that pattern, the discomfort is not about what was missing. It is about how easily the gap felt normal. Restoring this knowledge does not require reversing modern science. It requires placing it back into proportion. Sea buckthorn does not replace omega-3. It does not invalidate supplements. It does not solve every condition it has ever been associated with. What it does is illustrate a category modern frameworks struggle to hold: integrated biological sources that resist simplification. When examined honestly, the evidence places sea buckthorn in a narrow but legitimate space. It is one of the most concentrated natural sources of dietary omega-7. Its oil matrix supports absorption of fat-soluble compounds. Clinical studies explore specific outcomes, not universal cures. This is not a miracle. It is a functionally dense organism that performs predictably within defined limits. That distinction matters. Knowledge collapses when everything is forced into extremes, either dismissed or exaggerated. The original systems that preserved this plant did neither. They used it where it worked and ignored it where it did not. Modern frameworks can do the same if they are willing to acknowledge what falls outside their preferred categories. Sea buckthorn does not ask to be rediscovered. It has been present the entire time. What needs revision is not the plant, but the lens through which value is assigned. And that lens affects far more than nutrition. What follows is not a recommendation, it is a recalibration. Knowing this changes nothing unless it alters how information is weighed. Sea buckthorn does not demand adoption, it exposes a pattern. When knowledge is packaged only in forms that scale cleanly, understanding narrows. We learn to trust labels over structures and availability over relevance. The ethical choice is subtle. It is not about rejecting what is mainstream, it is about noticing what consistently falls outside the frame and asking why. Not with suspicion but with discipline. Who benefits when complexity is reduced? What is rewarded when integration is inconvenient? Which questions stop being asked because the answers do not circulate? This is how systems persist without force. They do not erase alternatives. They simply stop reinforcing them. Over time, familiarity becomes authority, repetition becomes truth, and absence becomes indistinguishable from insignificance. Sea buckthorn remains where it always has, unchanged by attention or neglect. The variable is not the plant. It is the observer. Whether information is accepted, ignored, or explored further depends on which incentives are allowed to guide curiosity. Attention does not need to become advocacy. It only needs to remain intentional. What survives in public knowledge is rarely what is most complete. It is what is easiest to repeat without friction. Once that is understood, the responsibility shifts quietly. Not to reject established frameworks, but to hold them open long enough for what does not fit to be seen. Sea buckthorn will not change the system by being consumed. It changes nothing by being praised. Its relevance ends where curiosity ends. The ethical choice here is not about adding another item to a routine. It is about resisting the habit of outsourcing judgment entirely to circulation. When something disappears without being disproven, the absence itself deserves inspection. This is how knowledge erodes without conflict, not through suppression but through neglect rewarded by efficiency. Restoring balance does not require rebellion. It requires patience with complexity and a willingness to sit with ideas that do not arrive prepackaged. The system will continue to favor what moves cleanly through it. That is what systems do. What remains undecided is whether attention follows the same path or whether it occasionally pauses to notice what was left behind. And that pause is where preservation begins.